She did not flinch. That was the part people never understood. Not her mother, not the solicitor, not even the women who later heard the story over tea and shook their heads with soft, horrified sounds. They assumed she must have trembled, or gone pale, or let her eyes fill. But Honoria Crane had long since learned that a woman who shows her wounds at the table only gives the table something to chew on. So when Mr. Aldous Fenn, her husband of 14 months, looked up from his pheasant and said, in the same tone a man might use to remark on the weather, that it was a pity she had not been blessed with her mother's face, Honoria simply set down her fork. Without a sound, without a word. She folded her napkin, placed it beside her plate with a precision that bordered on ceremony, and looked across the candlelight at the man she had married. He was already looking that was the moment, not the words. Words could be explained, softened, retracted, buried under an apology and a dozen roses. It was the looking away, the ease of it. The way his attention had already moved on to the joint of meat on his plate, as though what he'd said was simply a thing said, a passing observation, like noting that the soup had gone cold. There were 4 other people at that table. His cousin Reginald, who was visiting from Bath. His mother, Mrs. Fenn, seated at the far end with her customary expression of practiced dissatisfaction. The housekeeper, Mrs. Burwell, who had entered with the wine at precisely the wrong moment, and Honoria's own mother, Mrs. Crane, who had come to stay for the week and now sat very still with her hands in her lap, her eyes fixed on her plate. Not one of them spoke. Honoria pushed back her chair. She did not storm. She did not weep. She stood, smoothed her skirts with both hands, and said, "Excuse me," in a voice so level it might have belonged to someone discussing the menu. Then she walked out of the dining room, up the stairs, and into the bedroom she had shared with Aldous Fenn for over a year. She sat on the edge of the bed for approximately 30 seconds. Then she got up and opened the wardrobe. She had not come into this marriage with illusions. Her father had died when she was 19, leaving behind a house that was technically hers, and debts that were very concretely everyone's problem. Her mother had done what mothers of that era did. She had found a solution in the form of a man with a solvent estate and a mother who considered herself discerning. The arrangement had been presented to Honoria as an opportunity. She had understood it for what it was. Aldous Fenn was not cruel, in the beginning. He was simply absent in the way that men of his standing often were. Present at meals, present at church, present when guests came to call, but somehow never quite there in any way that mattered. He spoke to her about household matters, and occasionally about politics. He did not ask about her opinions on either. He had, in the early months, made certain gestures toward warmth. A book left on her reading chair, a comment that she had managed the dinner guests well. But these had grown rarer as the year progressed, replaced by a general air of tolerance that Honoria found more wearing than outright antagonism. Mrs. Fenn was another matter entirely. She was a woman who had spent 40 years perfecting the art of the indirect wound. She never said anything that could be quoted back to her in plain language. It was always phrased as concern. "I only mention it because I worry about you, dear," or as innocent observation. "Aldous was so fond of the garden before he married. It's such a shame he no longer tends it," or as comparison, which was her preferred weapon. The comparison was always to some woman Honoria had never met, some cousin or former neighbor whose domestic virtues were apparently immeasurable and whose continued existence seemed designed specifically to make Honoria feel inadequate. Honoria had endured it. She had kept the house well. She had managed the staff with fairness, and the accounts with care. She had hosted dinners that guests left satisfied, planned charitable contributions, overseen the repairs to the East Wing without complaint. She had done every single thing that had been asked of her, and several things that hadn't. And it had not made the smallest difference. She had known this, really. She had known it for months. But knowing a thing and being willing to act on it are two separate territories, and Honoria had not yet found her way from one to the other. Until tonight, she worked quickly and quietly. This was important, not because she was afraid of being stopped, but because she understood that a woman packing a trunk at 10 o'clock at night, in a house belonging to her husband, was a spectacle if anyone chose to make it one, and she had no interest in spectacle. She wanted to be gone before anyone thought to come upstairs and reason with her. She took what was hers. This was a principle she had decided upon, before she had finished choosing which dresses to fold first. Her books. The small cameo portrait of her father. Letters from her closest friend Edith, who lived in Edinburgh and wrote with the kind of honest warmth that was rare in correspondence. The practical things. Her better gloves, the wool coat her mother had given her, the medicines she kept in the drawer of her bedside table. She did not take the jewelry Aldous had given her as wedding gifts, except for her own ring, which she placed inside her glove rather than on her finger. She did not leave a note. She considered it briefly, standing at the writing desk with a pen in her hand. Then she set the pen down. There was nothing she wanted to say that Aldous would not already know, and nothing she could say that Mrs. Fenn would not find a way to twist into evidence that Honoria had always been this way. Difficult, lacking in temperament, so she said nothing. She had 2 trunks. She took one and a traveling bag. She came downstairs at 11:30. The dining room was quiet. They had finished without her, apparently, and gone their separate ways. She could hear Reginald in the smoking room, the distant murmur of his voice. She did not hear Aldous. She did not look for him. Mrs. Burwell was in the front hallway, and to her credit, she did not ask a single question. She was a practical woman who had worked in 3 houses before this one, and had seen enough to know when silence was the kindest choice. She simply helped Honoria carry the trunk to the door. "Is there anything else you need, Mrs. Fenn?" she asked quietly. Honoria paused. "I'll be going by my given name from now on," she said. Mrs. Crane. Mrs. Burwell nodded once. "Of course, ma'am." Honoria stepped out into the night. She had, in fact, made certain arrangements. This was not impulsive, or rather, it was impulsive in the way that an earthquake is impulsive. The pressure had been building for a long time, and tonight had simply been the moment the ground gave way. She had, in the back of her mind, been quietly preparing. Edith had written 6 weeks ago about a household in Edinburgh that was looking for a woman of practical intelligence to manage accounts and correspondence for a family of means. The salary was modest but adequate. The house was respectable. Edith had said, "I thought of you immediately, not because I think you need it, but because I think you would be very good at it, and because Edinburgh in the autumn is quite something." Honoria had written back to ask if the position was still available. It was. She had not told anyone, not her mother, not Edith yet. She had written only to ask, not to commit. But she had the letter with the address in Edinburgh folded inside her traveling bag, and she had enough money of her own, carefully set aside from the household allowance over 14 months, 1 careful week at a time, to pay for a coach to London and a train north. She spent that night in an inn 3 miles from the Fenn estate, in a room that smelled of wood smoke and old linen, and was entirely blessedly quiet. She slept better than she had in months. The position in Edinburgh was with a family called Drummond, a solicitor named Mr. Drummond and his wife, who was recovering from a prolonged illness and needed someone to manage the house's correspondence, oversee the domestic staff, and keep the accounts. There were 3 children, all of them self-sufficient enough to require supervision rather than tending. It was, in every practical sense, work Honoria had been doing for 14 months in her own marriage without acknowledgement or salary. Mr. Drummond was a precise man in his late 40s who had learned, through years of legal practice, to evaluate people on the basis of what they actually did, rather than what they said about themselves. He had interviewed Honoria for 45 minutes. He had asked about her method for managing household accounts, her experience with correspondence, her approach to staff disputes, and what she would do if she disagreed with a decision he had made. "I would tell you so clearly," Honoria said, "and explain my reasoning, and then I would follow your decision, unless I believed it would cause genuine harm." He had hired her on the spot. She had been in Edinburgh for 6 days when the first letter arrived. It came through Edith, which was the only address she had given. She had not told her mother where she was going, only that she was going, and that she would write when she was settled. Her mother's response to this, delivered through Edith, had been a complicated mixture of distress and a kind of reluctant admiration that she was not quite willing to voice directly. This, Honoria thought, was very much like her mother. The letter was from Aldous. She read it standing at the window of her small room, with the grey Edinburgh morning outside and the sounds of the Drummond household beginning to stir below. It was not what she expected. She had expected either anger or a careful, legal sort of letter about propriety and return, and the duties of a wife. She had not expected what was actually on the page, which was. She read it twice to be certain. Something very close to confusion. He wrote as a man who had walked into a room to find the furniture rearranged and could not quite understand when it had happened or why. "I did not intend for my words to cause harm," he wrote. "I did not know you felt the household to be so difficult." She set the letter down. She picked it up again. She read the line a second time. "I did not know you felt the household to be so difficult." 14 months. 14 months of managing his house, enduring his mother's careful cruelties, keeping her own counsel on every occasion, because the alternative was either a scene or a silence more humiliating than the original wound. And he had not known. It was not malice. This was the most disorienting thing. She had prepared herself for malice, had steeled herself against it on the coach to London, on the train north. What she had not prepared for was the genuine, uncomplicated absence of awareness that was apparently her husband's relationship to the interior life of their marriage. She wrote back a single paragraph. I did not leave because of one evening, though the evening was what made it impossible to stay. I left because for 14 months I have worked in this house with great care and considerable effort, and I have never, in all that time, been treated as though any of it mattered. You did not ask. You did not notice. And last night you said what you said and looked away, and I understood that waiting longer was not going to change anything. I wish you well, Aldous. I genuinely do. She sealed it and handed it to Edith to send. The weeks that followed were, she searched for the right word, and settled on clarifying. The Drummond household was not without its difficulties. Mrs. Drummond, whose illness was of the slow, grinding variety that wore a person down without ever quite releasing them, had strong opinions about how correspondence should be phrased, and was not initially convinced that Honoria's way of phrasing it was correct. There was a staff dispute in the second week, involving the cook and the second housemaid, that required careful navigation. One of the children, the eldest, a boy of 15 named George, had initially regarded Honoria with the specific suspicion that teenagers reserve for new adults in their household, and it had taken nearly a month before he stopped watching her from doorways. But the work was real, and the work was hers, and when she did it well, she knew it. Mr. Drummond said so in plain language at the end of each week, not effusively, but specifically, which Honoria found far more meaningful. The letter to the Crawford account was well handled. I noticed you caught the discrepancy in the October figures. These were small things. She had not realized, until she began to receive them, how hungry she had been for them. She wrote to her mother every week. Her mother wrote back with news of the village and carefully edited versions of what people were saying. And occasional references to Aldous in a tone that suggested she was waiting for Honoria to show signs of changing her mind. Honoria did not show signs of changing her mind. The second letter from Aldous came 6 weeks after the first. This one was longer, and she could tell, from the crossing out, from the places where the pen had pressed harder than usual, that it had been written and rewritten. He said he had spoken with his mother. He said the conversation had been, and here he chose a word she would not have expected from him, illuminating. He said he was not asking her to return, only that he wanted her to know he understood things now that he had not understood before. She read it 3 times. Then she wrote back and asked what specifically he understood, because she had found, in her experience, that understanding stated in general terms often turned out to be thinner than it looked. His response took 10 days. It was 4 pages long. She did not make the decision quickly. This was important to her, to not make it in a rush of feeling, to not mistake longing for clarity, because she had been in this country before, the country of wanting something to be true, and letting that wanting do the work that evidence ought to do. She had married Aldous Fenn with a certain careful optimism that had not been warranted. She did not intend to return to any version of that arrangement on the basis of letters alone. She wrote to him a question that had been sitting at the back of her mind since his second letter. What has your mother said about this? And what do you intend to do about what she has said? Because this was the question that mattered. Not whether Aldous had changed. She believed, reading his letters, that he had at least changed enough to try, which was more than she had thought possible. But Aldous changing and Miss Fenn changing were 2 entirely different problems, and Honoria had spent 14 months learning the difference between a husband who meant well and a household that could not be survived. His answer was prompt, this time. He had told his mother that she would need to establish her own residence if Honoria returned. He had told her this clearly and without, he said, much room for negotiation. Mrs. Fenn had objected. He had held the line. Honoria read this paragraph a 4th time, then a 5th. She showed it to Edith, who read it without expression and then said, That's either the truth or the most strategically well-phrased lie you'll ever receive. I know, Honoria said. What will you do? She was quiet for a long moment. Outside the window, Edinburgh's skyline cut gray angles against the evening. She had been here 4 months. She had built something here that was entirely hers. The work, the trust of the Drummond family, the particular satisfaction of a day that had gone well because of choices she had made. This was not nothing. This was in fact more than she had had for a very long time. I'm going to go back, she said, and see. She arrived on a Tuesday, which seemed to her appropriate, not a dramatic day, not a beginning of the weekday, simply a day in the middle of things, which was where she found herself. Aldous met her at the door. He looked, she thought, as a man looks when he has been thinking hard about something for a long time and has arrived somewhere he did not expect to arrive, uncertain and more open than she had last seen him, and a little afraid of what she was going to say. She had decided, on the train south, what she was going to say first. "I would like to see the household accounts," she said. "And then I would like us to sit down together and decide how this house is going to be run. Not how it has been run. How it is going to be run." He nodded. "Yes," he said. "Whatever you need." It was not a grand declaration. She had not expected one and had not wanted one. She had spent too long in the company of grand declarations to trust them. What she had wanted, what she was watching for, carefully, the way she had learned to watch for things, was the smaller evidence. Whether he listened when she spoke, whether he asked what she thought, whether he held what he'd promised. That first week he did. Mrs. Fenn had indeed moved to her sister's house in Gloucester. She had, according to Aldous, said several things on her way out the door that he declined to repeat, but that had apparently required a considerable effort to remain unmoved by. Honoria suspected this was true. She suspected that effort had cost him something, and that the costing of it had changed something in him, the way that paying a real price for a real thing always does. Mrs. Burwell returned her greeting on the first morning, with a warmth that told Honoria everything she needed to know about what the past 4 months had been like in this house. She did not forget any of it. She was not that kind of woman, and she would not have wanted to be. Forgetting, she thought, was a way of borrowing trouble, of allowing the same thing to happen again, because you had made it easy on yourself to believe it wouldn't. She remembered the table. She remembered the fork. She remembered the way his attention had moved, so easily, to the plate of meat before him, as though she were something that could simply be put aside. She remembered it, and she watched. Over the months that followed, real months, not the careful, hopeful weeks of early arrangement, but the ordinary months of an ordinary life, with its staff disputes and account discrepancies and evenings that ran long and mornings that began badly. She watched, and what she watched was this. Aldous Fenn, a man who had been formed by ease and inattention, and the particular blindness of men who have never been required to see, learning, slowly, imperfectly, with visible effort and occasional failure, how to see. He didn't always manage it. There were evenings when he said the wrong thing and didn't know he had. There were occasions when she had to say, plainly, that was not all right, and the first time she said it, his face did something complicated before he nodded. She did not soften it. She had spent too long softening things. But she said it without cruelty, which was all she had ever required of anyone, and what she found, what surprised her, was that he could hear it, that he did not, as she had half expected, look away. He did not look away. This was not nothing. In fact, and she was a woman precise enough to know the difference between settling and choosing. This was something, not everything, but something real and growing realer and built on ground that had actually been tested. She planted a kitchen garden in the spring. Aldous came out one afternoon and stood at the edge of the beds, with his hands in his pockets, watching her work. "I didn't know you gardened," he said. "There are a great many things you don't know about me," she said, without looking up. She drove the trowel into the earth. "You could ask." There was a pause. "What else don't I know?" he said. She sat back on her heels and looked up at him. This man she had married in obligation and stayed with by choice, this man who was, she permitted herself to think it, carefully, perhaps finally beginning to be worth knowing. "Sit down," she said. "I'll tell you."